Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone who is here for the lecture this afternoon. My name is Charmaine To, and I'm a curator at National Gallery Singapore, and I'll be chairing this session this afternoon. So I just wanted to start by welcoming everybody to the Living Pictures lecture series co-convened by National Gallery Singapore, as well as Dr. Alexander Sukartono. These lectures are organized in conjunction with an upcoming exhibition of photography that will open at the gallery in November later this year. Today, we are very pleased to have with us Dr. Kevin Chua to present his paper, Parmentier's Photographic Archaeology, which looks at the photographs of French archaeologist Henri Parmentier, which rests within the archives of the École Française d'Extrême-Orient, or EFEO. For those of us in the audience who attend gallery events regularly, you know that Kevin is no stranger to the gallery, having not only given talks, but also contributed to our publications on both modern and contemporary art in Southeast Asia. His research interests are wide, which brings, I think, to his talks and papers a remarkable perspective that I always enjoy. Kevin will be speaking for about 45 minutes today, after which we will have our respondent, Dr. Christophe Portier, who will speak for about 15 minutes. Christophe has had a long and distinguished career at EFEO and is an expert on ancient architecture, urbanism, and planning. And I briefly mentioned this at Tuesday's lectures for those of you who also attended the first lecture in the series, that early photography has a very complex history, crossing diverse fields, including art, science, and archaeology. And so we thought it was very important to have someone like Christophe here today to bring his perspective to this topic, something outside the field of art history, which is, usually where our talks and papers center around. So just one last note before I pass the time over to Kevin, which is that please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box anytime during the lecture. So even while the lecture is going, feel free to put in your questions. And after both speakers have completed their respective papers, we will have some time for Q&A. And during which I will address the questions in the Q&A box. So with that, I'll hand the time over to Kevin. Over to you.
Thanks, Charmaine. And thanks to the National Gallery for having me, and Roger and Charmaine, it's been a pleasure working with you both. Sometime in the late 19th century, photographs seeped into Europe that told tales of vast stone monuments in a faraway land. Photos such as this presented these ancient structures as explorers believed they had found them in states of ruin and decay. Trees and shrubbery partially obscure the building, masking a clear view of it. The building has hardly been touched. Our view is pristine. On the left, two faces peer out of the stone. One feels the awed excitement, the heady rush of discovery. Such photos appeared after Henri Mouhot's discovery of these monuments in 1860 during his travels in the Indochinese region. But if Mouhot included humans in his sketches, Gesell's photo is devoid of them. Such an absence makes his view more timeless and otherworldly. While such romanticized views made this part of the world available for picturesque and pleasurable armchair looking, they no doubt cleared the ground for military and political conquest. A whole ideology kept Europeans from thinking about the actual humans who lived and breathed in these distant lands. And against the photograph's rhetoric, to make it seem like we are looking at something truly unknown, I would say that it already assimilates the temple in question. We are presented with the view of a medieval castle. Here, renewed yet again, is the European fantasy about its own origins. Set this aside, another photo. We see two stone structures which seem to emerge out of the ground. We learn that they are two corners of a temple gable and that these are nagas, those half snake, half human creatures widely prevalent in Southeast Asia. But the photo disorients. Though the triangles point upwards, we cannot tell the correct orientation of these pieces. We also have trouble ascertaining scale. How large are they in relation to the rest of the building? Other questions crop up. What is the relationship between the left and the right pieces? Is this where the pieces were found, or have they been moved? And yet, in the way that the Nagas seem to emerge from the mouth of the Makara, the photo seems to understand the ritual significance of the decoration. For all its disorder, the photo is truthful about what and how we see. In the following talk, I want to bring you from the left photo to the right. Henri Parmentier's photo on the right, part of an archaeological and architectural study of the Temple of Wat Phu, published in 1914, is in many ways the opposite of Gesell's on the left. If the one on the left was seen as art, the one on the right was used for science. If the one on the left was carefully composed, the one on the right spurns artfulness. Yet I want to suggest that in its almost hasty composition and blunt matter-of-factness, the photo on the right better grasps the stakes of archaeological inquiry. Widening the distance between the left and right photos will take us some way toward uncovering the diverse uses of photography in Southeast Asia in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In a 2013 study, Julian Richard Brown was critical of Parmentier's photography. Though some of Parmentier's photos show the surrounding vegetation and terrain of the archaeological site, he writes, quote, "None show the archaeological process itself," unquote. For Brown, photography ultimately served as a handmaiden to drawing in Parmentier's archaeological and architectural practice. If Parmentier's work was about finding the ideal original structures of monuments, it was drawing that allowed this. As plan and elevation views reveal the inside of a building, the realistic depiction of the exterior on the left complements the drawing's overall mode of transparency. Yet from another angle, of course, this drawing is far from realistic. It abstracts or virtualizes, speculates on details despite lack of information, and despite its insistent embellishment and the inclusion of a human for scale, removes us from the archaeological site. At first, Brown's assessment seems correct. Parmentier's practice was idealizing, at least to an extent. Architectural drawings that depict plan and elevation views are used in all of the books and articles that he published over the course of his career. Such a privileging of drawing over photography recalls Frederick Catherwood's illustrations for John Lloyd Stevens's Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan. Volume 1 was published in 1841. By the time Volume 2 came out in 1843, there was public pressure to rely on the daguerreotypes that Catherwood had taken during the trip. And yet Catherwood did not find photography able to capture the vastness and grandeur of these Mayan monuments. Frederick Borer points out that, quote, "Photographic images may have been true to precisely how the monuments appeared in the dapple light of deep forests, but they were not useful to the artist's or archaeologist's project of representation," unquote. Photography was not discerning enough, not able to pick out the significant details of objects and monuments. And yet Parmentier did rely on photography, somewhat tentatively in the 1910s, but more forcefully in the 1920s and 30s. His method, I would argue, can better be understood less as an idealism than as a realism. Not simply interested in the original time of a building when it was first built, he was equally, if not more, interested in the multiple times of a building, the rebuildings and renovations, the states of incompletion. One could also say that Parmentier's ideal times, those punctual dates of construction of these monuments, were arrived at only by parsing errors, gaps, and discontinuities in each building. Rather than adhering to a rigid typology of style, discontinuity was constitutive of his method. In this talk, I will argue that Parmentier's photography had an archaeological function. In other words, his photos do not simply illustrate or document his prior on-site archaeological work. Rather, his photos are part of the process of figuring out and ascertaining the archaeological truth of these buildings. I will discuss Parmentier's photographic archaeology via 3 studies: his essay on Wat Phu in 1914, his study of Banté Stray in 1926, and his essay on construction in 1935. Parmentier's studies generally begin from the center, often the main building, working outward toward the rest of the complex. He identifies architectural structures, including decorative parts, all the while looking for structural anomalies and peculiarities. Centering himself around the classic period of Khmer architecture, he makes comparisons with other buildings. His entire method, learned at the École des Beaux-Arts in France, was informed by style, whereby a building is situated along a continuum of morphological form. The normal and the ordinary are differentiated from the abnormal and the aberrant. Here is a passage from his study of Wat Phu. Quote, "The main building is designed according to the classic Khmer plan, a very long room and 2 annexes on a lower level, placed in direct communication by 2 large doors without leaves. It widens sharply in the middle by the projection of its front wall. To this projection corresponds a vestibule, a veritable porch opening onto the esplanade by a free door and 4 empty bays. The building, both in its central part and in its 2 annexes, emerges from the forecourt through 14 beautiful windows with balusters. A side door opens at each end," unquote. Now, what's surprising about this photo is the way it does so little to orient us as viewers in relation to the building as a whole. We are given a view of the side door from the outside rather than a view from the inside the building looking out. But notice how the photo is what results after moving through a portion of the building. Parmentier understands architectural form as the result of that prior bodily movement. Some photos present us with oblique viewpoints. Consider this photo, which seems less interested in the sanctuary at left and more in the narrow hallway on the right. Parmentier will discuss the strut that juts out from the right wall just below the corbel. It is difficult to make out what the strut connects to on its left side, though we can see it more easily in a contemporary photo. Here is Parmentier's discussion. The main building has 3 naves and has 5 bays, the one in the center forming a transept. They show beautiful sandstone pillars, square, with trusses smaller than usual, but also better design. The side walls are made of brick and stone, the latter constituting the exterior cladding. A beam embedded in the penultimate course serves as a reinforcing tie, which adds rigidity to the whole. A cornice reigns along the walls of the struts, and the architraves are molded above the capitals. The wall is corbelled with the transept to reach the level of the architraves and could hide side half vaults. A ceiling could be received by the projection of the architraves, thus masking the superior arrangements, which we will come back to later. That italicized phrase is interesting. What is this ability of the building to hide part of its structure? Was this intentional on the part of the builders and part of the architecture, or is it something hallucinated by Parmentier? I would say that Parmentier is picking up something intentional on the part of the builders. This is no mere perceptual effect. For isn't the function of a temple to conceal and reveal, with the sanctuary the place that did the most hiding and revealing? Curiously, Parmentier doesn't remark on the human statue on the left of the photo, probably a Buddha put there by worshippers in the early 1910s, nor the small figurines on top of the altar. The photo doesn't resolve these uncertainties and seems itself to participate in the hiding and revealing. Here's the photo I began my talk with, alongside Parmentier's accompanying description. The three naves of the eastern vestibule each have their own facade crowned with pediments or semi-pediments. Nothing remains in place of its pediment, and its mass is given only by the silhouette of the south gable and by the height where the lateral cornices of the great nave reign. We only know one element, which is luckily typical. It is the two nagas that came to stand up at the bottom of the rampants. Their very cutout silhouette and the height at which they are detached from the rampant itself indicate for the rampant a straight and even concave shape. These three-headed nagas, along with light blooms of water, emerge from the mouth of a makara. Above the naga heads, a triangular pattern of decoration of an unusual type further accentuates their sharp silhouette. The naga is carved on both sides. We were able to find the elements of one of these two very interesting motifs, the piece on the left. Only the upper part of the other, the piece on the right, remained, which has a slightly different angle. Notice careful attention to the felt materiality of these stone sculptures, which moves between 2 and 3 dimensions and is considered hypothesis of the way the different forms interrelate. But again, the photo seems deliberately disorienting. We cannot tell which side of these objects is up, nor the correspondence between the left and the right pieces. Certain phrases, the two nagas that came to stand up, point to an anxiety on the archaeologist's part for orientation. At least from his description, the pieces were found there. The casualness of the photo bleeds archaeological authenticity and truthfulness. This is an unvarnished on-site find. And yet the photo resists definite assertions. The disorientation of the photo is, I would argue, paradoxically what allows him to inhabit and perhaps understand the ritual significance of the decoration. The nagas emerge from the mouth of the makara as though right in front of us. Parmentier is not simply describing, but experiencing these sculptural reliefs, meaning that he puts himself in the ritual, which is also how a historical beholder would have experienced the temple. So much of Parmentier's detective work at the archaeological site involves figuring out different times of construction to understand the multi-layered temporality of any building. Few of the Angkorean temples were built at a single moment, and their varied use suggests different temporalities. For example, the wall that rises above the south architraves is not from a single occurrence. At the east end, it shows freestone. At the west side, it is made of bricks, and the line that separates these different materials is that of ruined masonry. One wonders if the current coarse construction did not replace an old sanctuary to which the current nave was annexed. Towards the end of Khmer power, the first sanctuary, too old, may have collapsed, dragging down the end of the new room, while the vaults of this part of a very daring construction could not resist the tremendous upheaval caused by this ruin. There was in fact an older temple at the site of Wat Phu, which may have been there as early as the 5th century. What his investigations reveal are the non-ideal times of the building, with the insight that every building involves reconstruction and revision. At the end of his essay, Parmentier reflects on the inextricability of the architecture from religious ritual. It is almost certain that this water source held a role in the worship itself. The channel of the west wall opens inside more than 1 meter from the ground, the Soma Sutra of the north wall flush with the ground. We are therefore tempted to believe that holy water flowed over a linga and out through the spout of the tank and the Soma Sutra. This arrangement would be primitive unless we relate to this channel the pretty sculpted slab with an almond-shaped outline, which is so oddly pierced with a hole in the middle. Thus, at all times, the divine image has always been watered without stoppage by the water born in some way from the formidable linga that is the mountain dominating the temple, unquote. In other words, water is not just symbolically important, but is incorporated into and performatively activated by the architecture. The watering of the linga, enabled by the water flowing through the hole, reenacts the cosmological beginning of water flowing down from the linga mountain. Remarkably, a photograph is at the center of his analysis. The slab looks like yet another one of his found objects. This casual photo presents, rather than represents, the entire building. Instead of an ideal certainty, the photo rotates around an absence, a hole. Faced with the paradox of water shooting through a flame, we would do better by treating knowingness with disdain. And what are we to make of the steps behind the slab? Is the photo figuring some sort of ascent or descent? Perhaps the repeated horizontal lines mark time, with the repetition returning us, potentially, into continuous cyclical time. Parmentier's 1926 book on Bante Sray was written with Louis Finot and Victor Golibieu, with Finot writing on the epigraphy, Parmentier the architecture, and Golibieu the decorations. Parmentier points out that Golibieu was in charge of the photos, and it's an important acknowledgement, as Parmentier closely refers to them throughout his chapter. In my analysis, I will assume that the photos were a product of a close collaboration between Golibieu and Parmentier. Parmentier may have given Golibieu instructions on particular shots to take, while Golibieu's photos clearly shaped Parmentier's thinking. As at Wat Phu, we see Parmentier seemingly identifying and describing the temple complex at Bante Sray, starting from the inner or first enclosure and working outwards. But rather than doing mere empirical description, it is Parmentier's experiential response to these monuments and decoration that's key. His photos do not just illustrate conclusions reached after his archaeological practice. Rather, photography was used as a tool to work through archaeological problems. In what follows, I will try to correlate the form of the photos with the formalization or coming into being of both building and decoration. In the 1920s, Parmentier's analysis of architectural form became more intensive. He is more aware of the constitutive dimension of form, meaning form's capacity to produce experience as one moves through a building. Take this analysis of a figure in a niche. The entrepilast is decorated in the same way throughout its surface. Below is a male figure in a niche with thin pilasters supported by a small ogee plinth adorned with 3 Atlantean lions. The arch of the niche has the usual wavy outline, and the whole has the general profile of a fairly sharp pointed arch drawn by an ornament of flaming leaves. A pendant hangs from the top of the arch. The slender pillars with base and cornice have their faces chiseled in diamonds. The figure, hunched, holds a spear in one hand, a hanging flower in the other. His hairstyle is in a high bun. He is dressed in a sampot and wears no jewelry and rests on a square die decorated with a lotus, which determines a movement in the support of the niche, unquote. While it seems like Parmentier is merely picking out elements that we might not have ordinarily noticed, like this pendant. More interestingly, he finds sculpture and decoration animated and alive. The figure is hemmed in from two directions by the pendant above and the lotus below. A push-pull, upward-downward tension produces the niche and makes visible what is in front of us. Flaming leaves, whether closing in or radiating outward, frame the figure, but are also at the edge of the figure's, our being. Parmentier is not just being sensitive to form here, he is tracking the way sculptural architecture produces our very experience, the moment-to-moment shifting of weight of our bodies. The photo's intelligence is to bring us close enough such that this niche becomes tactile, available to our touch. For only at this close distance does the niche come alive. Space seems to disappear, time stands still. As we stand in front of the figure at eye level, the photo is likely taken on a ladder, we notice we are hovering. Here is a photo of two towers after dégagement or clearance, in other words, after minimal conservation work had been done. Yet the conservation approach tended to leave these buildings as picturesque ruins. In peering through the doorframe to the linga, in the central sanctuary on the left, this view feels like a fantasy of what the original building looked like. Though Parmentier includes photos of temple structures both before and after clearance, I think the photos after clearance are more revealing because they are more contradictory and show multiple layers of time. The introduction of the method of anastylosis, the piece-by-piece disassembling and reassembling of every stone in a building, would change the stakes of conservation. Anastylosis sought to restore a building to its original state using only original materials. Since the 1910s, the French had been practicing minimal intervention, clearing away wood and debris, reassembling portions of buildings where possible, installing reinforcing structures where necessary, as a way to preserve the natural and seemingly untainted view of these temples, even as they granted the European public access to them. But the growing number of tourists who visited Angkor Park in the 1920s made matters more urgent. Though the French had known of Dutch archaeological work in Java since 1900, the demand to deploy the Dutch method intensified in the late 1920s. The Dutch were practicing not conservation, but reconstruction, later dubbed anastylosis by the French after the Greeks. And though there was debate on the merits of both approaches, reconstruction won over most of the leading archaeologists. Having been tasked by George Sedis to implement the method at Angkor, Henri Marchal left for an investigatory trip to Java in May 1930, bringing the method back to Indochina. He first tested it out on the Temple of Preah Khan in late 1930, then at Bante Stray from 1931 to 36. For Michael Falser, anastylosis fueled a myth of Angkor, that belief in a grand civilization that shone brightly between the 9th and 13th centuries and waned soon after, that was created and propagated by the French. The myth importantly survived after the colonizing French left Cambodia into the cultural heritage industry that took shape from the 1980s onward. While Falser's historical detailing of the process is exemplary in its thoroughness, his strong post-colonial critique flattens out all the archaeological, architectural, scientific, and epigraphic investigations done before the 1970s. Everything is subsumed into Foucault's totalizing insight that knowledge is the handmaiden of power. Anastylosis has the aura of scientific authority and is seldom critiqued. Yet the accuracy and rigor of the method is dependent on the architect's prior understanding of the construction of any particular building. Thankfully, we know from Marshall's report of his archaeological mission to Java in 1930 that he, like Parmentier, was less interested in the true original building than in the construction problems of buildings. In his Nastilosis work on Bantisre beginning in 1931, at least, Marshall would have drawn from Parmentier's 1926 study, and in his 1939 book on classic Khmer architecture, Parmentier is praiseful of Marshall's reconstructive work there. Consider this photo, taken by an unknown photographer in May 1934, showing anastilosis of the Northern Library at Bantisre. Marshall recounts. At the end of the month, we began to remove the stones of the Northern Library with a view to rebuilding it after producing drawings, plans, and photos, ensuring that the work went according to schedule. In May 1934, work was carried out directly in the two libraries in order to save time, leveling the ground after removing all the stones, the concrete area under the walls, including the four corners located before the filler course, and the first cut stones were taken apart and reassembled, unquote. The photo shows some of the large equipment and machinery used for the reconstruction work: cranes, wooden scaffolding, pulleys. Stone blocks are scattered around the buildings as though awaiting reconstruction. Khmer workers gather at the work site. But if most of them nonchalantly return the photographer's gaze, they are hardly the ones who are important in this archaeological project. At the center of the photo is Marshall, examining a drawing of the library with one Mr. Chan, who produced architectural drawings for the reconstruction. The photo, with its commanding view from on high, seems to encapsulate the drawing, which is puny and unreadable, but also drawing as such. And this seems like the inverse of the Stevens Catherwood moment. Photography here tells the truth of archaeology, not drawing. The photo can also stand for how its users thought of anastilosis in the 1930s as powerful, rigorous, and scientifically correct. But should we read the photo in terms of the mythic ideal of anastilosis, that the method could perfectly grasp and reconstitute the original building? Or can the photo also stand for the method's failure, with the more realist understanding that any reconstruction will always be incomplete and partial? At the center of the photo is a blank rectangle, a washed out page. Borer cautions. Even at its most seemingly straightforward, archaeological photography records how a site virtually never looks, but rather how its directors want it to be for the record. It is the product of a field decision that effaces as much as possible the field work, the human presence itself. Site photography, he adds, often functioned as a kind of protocol, a deliberate way of seeing, and in some case overlooking the plenum of archaeological experience. A good example of Parmentier's experiential phenomenological method appears in this passage. In front of the facades, hidden by the rich composition of the end doors, is a small, purely decorative forward body, of which only the corner pillar in the lower section appears, adorned on its front face with a strip of foliage staffs, with a stem decoration on its lateral face. By the corner pillar in the lower section, I think he's referring to one of the columns on the right. Notice the way in the photo, the right columns appear staggered back, while the left columns appear flat. We make out the corner, in other words, by the shadows in the photo. The only Salmont in his sentence is crucial. It implies that the rest of the building has not yet come into visibility. Now, from a contemporary photograph, we can tell that the actual building is symmetrical. Left and right sets of columns are equally set back. But Parmentier is not simply seeing an illusion here. Rather, his viewing mimics the way a historical viewer would have seen the facade, the building coming gradually into view based on the time of the day, as it were. It's as though with sunlight falling on it, the building was appearing right in front of our eyes. His phenomenological viewing is also structuralist, meaning that every element is attended to as part of a larger whole, with buildings measured against other buildings. He picks out the pediment behind the front pediment, the view into depth, jostling here with its tendency to flatten or dissolve in front of the viewer. We seem to hover undecidedly between the facade's forward and back, vertical and lateral movements as we stand in front of the library. Parmentier's investigation extends to the lintels in the complex. He describes the bottom lintel of this photo. The lintel of the east door of the vestibule, the general entrance door of the group formed by the central sanctuary and the room which precedes it is of the same type, but of a particular character due to its deep carving. Its garland strongly juts out from the bottom of the foliage. Now, though the French word défoncement here refers to the depth of cutting, which I have translated as carving, it normally connotes breaking or defacement. In another essay, Parmentier noticed that the demolition of 16 passageways at the Bayan may have been an iconoclastic destruction that took place during and not at the end of the reign of Jayavarman VII. His attunement to iconoclasm thus fits within his broader understanding of the way these Angkorean temples were periodically rebuilt, renovated, and remade. While his use of the word défoncement was probably just an overemphasis on his part, more interesting is if he was unconsciously responding to something in the lintel. We could ask how photography is intrinsically iconoclastic. Walter Benjamin famously wrote in 1936, 10 years after Parmentier's chapter on Bande-Strée, of how mechanically reproduced photography and cinema destroys the aura, the unique presence and authority of traditional mediums such as painting and sculpture. The destruction of aura, he thought, was a way for mechanically reproduced imagery to contest dominant norms and power relations. In this photo, the curious way in which the lintel is shown beneath another deprives the lower lintel of its originality and uniqueness. It's a cog in a larger machine. And displaced from its original site above a door, the lintel is suspended, put in a holding space ready for scientific and scholarly study. One could also argue that the photo challenges, de-oraticizes the myth of Bande-Strée. With the retrocession of Siem Reap to France in 1907, the myth of Angkor took off. And in the late 1920s, touristic photography of Angkor temples began. Archaeological or scientific photos like Parmentier-Golubu's may have worked against touristic photos such as this. But keep in mind that the archaeologists were guilty of producing touristic photos themselves. This photo was taken by Marchal. Towards the end of the chapter, Parmentier states the greater importance of his photographs compared to his drawings. The drawings which complete and shed light on the study and which will be found following the photographic documents are not strictly speaking a statement of the monument. It seems to us that the remarkable documentation gathered by Mr. Golubu made it unnecessary to publish a graphic report of the old building. Our drawings are rather intended to facilitate the reading of the photographs and to allow an easier conception of what the monument was in ancient times, unquote. The drawings, in other words, were intended to assist a reading of the photos. It is the photos that are primary. In his essay, Construction in Classic Khmer Architecture of 1935, Parmentier articulated his long-standing argument with regard to Khmer architecture. For him, it was the long inheritance of wooden, what he called light architecture, that dated from at least the 9th century, that gave the classic 9th to 15th century period of architecture in Angkor its structural intelligence. What is counterintuitive about his thesis is that despite the Khmers being known for stone architecture in the classic period, think of large complexes like Angkor Wat, Parmentier comes to a defense of what is for him a more encompassing framework of wooden architecture. Wood was used even in the early stages of stone architecture, and such a mixed architecture, for example, in the wooden beams used to give greater support to a stone vault, had a unique strength and flexibility that was gradually lost as the Khmers switched to the sole use of stone. Even in the 1920s and 30s, it was common amongst French architects to decry Khmer stone building techniques, a criticism that was no doubt Orientalist and primitivist. In other words, it was a prejudice towards the inherent inability of the natives to build complex structures. In arguing for the relative sophistication of Khmer light and mixed architecture, Parmentier's theory, at least partially, breaks away from such Orientalism. And in arguing for the structural intelligence that grew out of the Khmer translation of wood into stone architecture, Parmentier's theory also moves beyond, or at least tempers, the old diffusionist argument that credited the strength of Khmer buildings to an influx of architectural ideas from India. One way wood architecture passed into stone was in the foundations of buildings. The old buildings often began with wooden posts deeply piled into the ground. Early in his construction essay, Parmentier shows us the following two photos. His accompanying text is as follows. The wooden uprights of the old buildings in light construction had to be planted deep in the ground, like those of the Cambodian house, to ensure greater stability. The posts provided the frame for the slab frame that could cover one or the other form with, as in some light buildings in Laos, a fictitious base of planks or molded plaster. We see in the construction of the mixed edifices 1 of Prayrup 538, the porch pillars cross the lower courses and penetrate more than 1 meter deep into the foundations, unquote. Now, in the top photo, Parmentier seems to be referring to the 3 pillars slightly left of center next to the standing man. The point seems to be that the stone pillars that we see in this photo inherited their more than 1 meter bases from wooden posts. What is a bit odd is that the burden of the photo is to demonstrate the presence of these below the ground pillars, which we cannot directly see. Wouldn't the bottom photo have sufficed? And in this photo, the dugout portion of the ground where the lower portion of the pillars would have been is on the left. The top photo makes its argument by the man standing next to the pillars who provides scale, but also by, somewhat counterintuitively, showing us the broad expanse of the terrace that the pillars were part of. To put it simply, in the top photo, why does Parmentier show us this terrace? I think that these two photos, in all their difficult to read ambiguity, get to the heart of how Parmentier was using photography in his archaeology. The bottom photo showing the deeply piled holes isn't enough. The two photos stage a relationship. If a certain kind of photography in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, black boxed photographic technique as a method of social control, Parmentier's photos, I would say, reveal process and open up the archaeological site to contingency. In the top photo, the wide open terrace is key. Whether these two photos engage or comprehend the ineffable ground of the building is also an issue. How could photography, like the wooden posts, penetrate that which was below the surface? Parmentier acknowledges at one point in his essay that, quote, the exploitation of the temple ground itself was the sought after ideal of the Khmers, unquote. His discussion brings to mind what architectural historian Kenneth Frampton has called the presencing of a building, not just its physical occupation of space, but its culturally unique exploitation of its environment. Parmentier figures out that the earth is softer the farther it is from the surface. Arriving at his insight via consultation with Khmer locals, the episode also testifies to the collaborative nature of archaeological knowledge. I have learned from the old governor of Kamsan, who installed the sala during the visit of His Royal Highness Prince Damrong, that in planting posts in the large rock bank on which the main staircase is placed, the slide met with resistance only within 30 or 40 centimeters of the upper surface and could be drilled as in agglomerated sand, resistance decreasing with depth, unquote. Unlike the sullen workers in the 1934 anastylosis photo, here Khmer individuals form the invisible ground of Parmentier's archaeology. Let me end with a photo of the installation of the Thap Mam Room of the Museum of Tram Art in Da Nang, Vietnam, which Parmentier initially directed. It shows several sculptures haphazardly arranged, some next to the wall, some on the ground, in what looks like the early stages of the installation process. The sculptures are not yet locked into their final positions. Exemplifying Parmentier's archaeological photography, the photo allows him to think through, to mentally rehearse the layout of the sculptures in the room. But of course, photography doubles archaeology by the nonlinear succession and layering of images in the viewer's mind. On the left of the photo is what looks like a ruler leaning against a pedestal like a scaffolding in one of Parmentier's site photos. Measurement for a brief moment takes a back seat as we ponder the boundless, multifarious, and irreducible conditions of the archaeological site. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, for that fantastic paper. Lots of things to think about. But right now, I'm going to invite Christoph to present his response, and then we'll have a discussion and Q&A after. So over to you, Christoph.
Good afternoon, good morning for those where we are still in morning. Yeah, I will actually share my screen. If just a moment. Yes. Is it okay for you?
Yeah, you want to go to full screen? It's now on the slide.
It's not yet full screen, just a moment. Is it okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, actually, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the National Gallery of Singapore to give me the opportunity to talk today. Thanks a lot to Kevin actually for inviting me to respond somehow to this very dense and interesting talk. In fact, it has been really a nice pleasure for me to discuss this story of Parmentier's photographic archaeology, and it actually pushed me to go and to dig a little bit more than into EFEO's history, into EFEO's archives, and into also my own archaeological experience somehow. And through that the research I did to prepare that discussion today, I actually had a kind of a new encounter with Parmentier. At least I have the feeling to have been a bit closer to what he has been doing, to his thoughts, and actually this feeling to be a bit closer with that guy comes probably from the quite striking portraits, like the one I'm showing to the screen now. And actually, these portraits are, I think, somehow interesting in the sense that they give us, or at least it gave me, different readings of a long experience of Parmentier. You know, in fact, he started working for the École Française in Indochina at the time in 1900, and died actually in Phnom Penh in 1943. So let's say half a century of his work. And of course, it's quite complex. It has changed through time, space, and so on. And let's say ancient photographs from him or from others actually help us to see the diversity of this work. You see the different moods he may have between a smiling face and a more serious one, different perspective, different period of his life when he was a bit younger on the field, with a different kind of dress, sometimes completely exhausted with fever and so on after a long stays in very remote places and so on. So actually, Parmentier is of course multiple and so on. And we may have various portraits. Some of them are quite famous. For instance, the one on the left, I think, is part of your exhibition in Singapore. And of course, it's always quite important to keep them in and to put them in context. For instance, the picture on the left of Parmentier, probably in the 30s, late 30s, is well known and has been criticized recently because, for instance, he put his leg on a statue of defaced Buddha and so on, which of course may look a bit unrespectful according to an exterior observer these days. But if we replace that into the context of where he was at that time, we have to figure out that this was in the middle of the Angkorean forest, in a small depot where actually all these broken statues were kept, hundreds of them. So you can see actually for him, we are not in a sanctuary here. We are on his desk. We are actually in the place where he was actually spending his days, his daily routine, I would say. His daily routine also appears through his own archives, and that's the other side of the mirror. Kevin have shown us today very interesting pictures of what actually Parmentier wants us to see. Actually, there are also other pictures which actually are not actually the kind of stuff which would be published. For instance, him on his daily, on his living condition, for instance, in Sambor-Precook, where he spent months in the middle of nowhere documenting this site. And also something which is quite absent from EFEO publication is actually his partner, Jeanne Lebas, who has been a key player in Parmentier's career. She was actually a pianist, and she joined Parmentier in 1905, accepted to follow him and to contribute to his work despite very bad living conditions. And she has been a key player, helping him, assisting him, and also publishing his work after his death in 1943. So Jeanne Lebas, again, is almost absent from his work. Here it's an overview of the living condition they had at that time. And of course, here again, we are in the middle of a tower, in the middle of an ancient sanctuary. So it doesn't really look very, it looked a bit weird according to present day standards. But actually at that time, it was the only way to survive and to live in this in the forest where there was no village around and so on. So you see, we have things which are shown, others which are not shown, like the man on the picture, the woman absent, and so on. About what is shown and what is not shown, we have Kevin show this interesting picture from illustrating the work, the anastomosis work of Marshall in Bantes-Rey. Here again, it's a kind of a portrait which gives us something to see. But somehow this picture may slightly, it's look a bit artificial on the first stage, but frankly, it's one part of one of the other EFEO portraits, for instance, of Marshall, a couple of months probably before. Actually, that's a kind of posing Marshall in front of the main sanctuary of Bantes-Rey. And here again, Marshall has been spending his life since the beginning of the 20th century, died in 1969 or 1970 in Siem Reap. And we have different views of at different period of his life, how he is representing himself as the curator of Angkor. And sometimes in quite poor condition. Here again, we can see the guy totally exhausted after probably a very long day at work, in a posture which clearly also place him in a tradition. For instance, this picture was taken just below the very famous picture of Carpeaux, Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux, who was the first French curator, one of the first French curators working in Angkor in 1901, who actually have a very portrait taken on that window. And this portrait also, the second one somehow duplicate the one in 1934 in Bantes-Rey. And these ones on the right have been made in his much later advanced age. It was in the 50s in a different sample, which is ironically called also Bantes-Rey. It has the same name, but it's a very different thing. And here again, we see Marshall not alone actually, and the Khmer are actually not that passive at all. He's always interacting and doing the job with the Khmer, his assistants and so on, which actually played a very significant role. And in fact, Marshall appears in many other places during the working process with the Khmer themselves. For instance, all these are different pictures of Bantes-Rey process. And just highlighting Marshall, actually, Marshall is on the job among his workers, with the workers with the heat, with the water, with the rains and so on. So it's not only just a question of posing for the picture, it's part of a job, and the job actually is made by real people, by real workers. And most of the pictures actually documenting the process of Bantes-Rey, and there were actually a lot of pictures documenting that particular work because it was the first application of this method of anastylosis. Actually, many of the pictures actually show the workers doing the job. So actually, this portrait is quite interesting also for, as Kevin mentioned, the white empty plan at the center. Actually, of course, it's part of it may be part of a lot of interpretation and so on. My interpretation may be more basic in the sense that actually this is the kind of plans than Marshall and his assistants were actually drawing. That's actually, you see technical plans with drawings of the blocks, of dimension and so on. And this is actually slightly different from Parmentier's job. And so basically they were looking to these kind of documents, and you see the contrast with previous Parmentier's surveys and depiction, for instance, here on the top left, before the reconstruction. And that's actually one of the restitution of Parmentier in this book Kevin referred to in 1920, what was it? 27 or 24, I don't even remember. But anyway, the restitution by Parmentier is very interesting because it's a regular joke between French archaeologists to mention that Parmentier actually was wrong in his restitution. He actually missed one failed stairs in the towers. As you can see, that's Henri Marchal drawings after the anastylosis, where we can count 1, 2, 3 main stages, which actually in Parmentier's restitution there was only two main ones. So this is a slightly interesting moment where somehow architectural work move. It's not a question only of methodology of anastylosis and restoration. It's actually how we move from the shape and decoration into a much more constructivist and structuralist way of understanding the architecture. In fact, it's a kind of a paradox because globally speaking, Henri Parmentier is somehow the champion of survey, of drawings, and he was actually an architect before anything else, before even being an archaeologist. And that's actually one particularity of the heritage and conservation tradition in Angkor, is that it has been done by architects mostly, if not only, until the 1960s, which is very different from many other archaeological places in the world, which were actually run by archaeologists by training. These guys were architects before to be archaeologists. And somehow Parmentier was one of the most, the first architect, the first of a long succession and a generation of architects who actually worked in Angkor. But it's true then somehow the Parmentier, if we actually go through the EFEO archives, not only the one available online, which actually is this EFEO collection here, which have more than 26,000 pictures related to Cambodia, including actually more than 12,000 relating to Angkor and so on. But if you also have various private collections by its previous researchers, which have been given to EFEO. And actually, as you can see, the Parmentier collection is one of the most important ones. It has more than 4,000 pictures by Parmentier himself, which help us to understand actually his daily work and really how he used photography, not only for publication, but actually on his daily routine, on his practice. And clearly, what's come from that is, yeah, of course, Parmentier is an architect trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, is very classy in this way of approaching. He has been taught by drawings, survey, watercolors. That's very classic École des Beaux-Arts, late 19th century tradition. And somehow it's exactly what we can see in the early publication of Parmentier, for instance, in his work of Ponagar in 1902. Most of these plates are watercolors, very long, it's time consuming, but it's very nice pictures and so on. I'm sorry for the poor quality of the black and white reproduction here, but actually we lost the original drawings. And very interestingly, in just a couple of years, in 1904, a second paper he published about Misson is completely different. Actually, he just left big watercolors plate and so on, and actually just use photographs to document the exterior of the monument. So there is a kind of a shift at that time. Somehow, actually, it may show also how somehow Parmentier took interest into photography in order to go much faster than what he had to do before. And that's the kind of daily practice we can now start to investigate into closer detail, thanks to the work which has been made on EFEO archives recently. And there are now the personal archives, where are dozens of documents and dossiers of Parmentier, many of them unpublished, which are now available in the archive to go through. So, and in fact, I tried to go into that, and clearly, yes. The main goal of Parmentier, the story of his life, was actually to make this kind of classic monument inventory. That was his main task. And actually, he understood it as, we only describe something if it's worth doing, if it's actually a bit special compared to what is from the common type, actually. This is the classic way of understanding his work. But somehow in 1925, Parmentier published an interesting text, which is quite hidden somewhere in the EFEO chronicles, where actually Parmentier gave some instructions to the various architects and archaeologists from the EFEO in order to establish this detailed inventory of the monuments. And clearly here we see Parmentier's understanding of an architect as first trained, as he mentioned, trained for the observation and drawings. This is actually observation and graphic documentation. They are the key element for him. And somehow in his positions, survey or photograph will have to come only in supplement, in such a way that their disappearance can never make the pure description insufficient. Somehow it's go against what he just wrote 1 year before in the book of Ishvarapura than Kevin just mentioned. Somehow he just contradicted himself in just in a couple of months somehow, and I think that was interesting to show up. This paper in 25 also give us some information about how he used photograph also to complement surveys, and he even proposed his various colleagues, actually, if they don't know how to use this photograph in the correct way and so on, they can send it to him in Hanoi, and if necessary, he will correct the photograph to make a proper survey. So here again, digging into the archives, we can see the quantity of photograph he used, and they are somehow very limited. For instance, that's a list of different files on monuments, a lot of depictions, but actually just few pictures, one here, one there, one there, one there. But there are more than 20 graphic surveys and so on. That's what it looked like, his original depiction. Many drawings, many descriptions, boring description most of the time, and some pictures, some black and white prints directly made from his stereoscopic pictures. Here again, for instance, for a pedestal here with a lot of drawings and surveys, and just a poor black and white, quite obscure photograph. That's also the daily work, in fact, of Parmentier. And for instance, Kevin told us about Wat Phu, for instance. Wat Phu, which is a funny temple in the work of Parmentier, since he actually published it first in 1914, then reworked on it in the 20s, and finally published it in 1939 at the end of his life, modifying very few sections of its text and depiction. And the funny part is when in 1939, for instance, in his last depiction of the temple, he actually cut short the pictures he previously published. He selected only 4 of them among 30, and he actually published only 4 of them with the last depiction of a temple, which including these quite interesting nagas when Kevin mentioned about. I took the opportunity also to show another pictures showing how these nagas were actually very visible right at the entrance of a temple, and somehow they are very unique to that particular temple. This is an 1896 old photograph, and they are still there. In fact, or at least they were still there 2 years ago when I went there. And again, for instance, Kevin mentioned how Parmentier very interestingly made a link between this single object with all this hydraulic theory and so on. And somehow he was totally right about the importance of water rituals and so on in the case of Wat Phu. Unfortunately, he was a bit wrong for the interpretation of this antefix, since other ones has been found during recent excavation in the 90s, and they show actually they are not particularly related to any hydraulic work, despite there are traces of hydraulic canalization. I will finish very quickly because I've been probably already too long, with actually one other usage of Parmentier, and one value of Parmentier pictures is also the documentation of sites in different stage of discovery. Many of them were actually remote sites in the middle of nowhere. That's the case, for instance, again for Bantesfray, where thanks to Parmentier, who was sent to the site after the looting in 1823 by the French poet Henri Parmentier at that time. So here we have the documentation just after the looting, and it was already useful at that time against looting. It is still extremely important for us to document more modern lootings. For instance, these ones in Coquer. Parmentier has been one of the very few guys who actually covered and documented Coquer, and his photograph become really key pieces for all this process of looted pieces restitution, which is going on these days, especially from US collections. Besides, it's not only about looting, but many of these archive pictures, not only by Parmentier, but others may still hold a lot of significance for modern research. And that was the case, for instance, with these pictures, which are also, I think, part of the exhibition you have in Singapore, but this big Buddha excavated in the Bayonne in the 30s. And actually with the big Buddha, on the left, which is, as you see, very tall and so on, was found this very small head just next with the thumbs. These two pieces down here are, if you see at the bottom of a small Buddha, these are two thumbs of the big Buddha. But the small head actually, which is still now kept in the Angkor Conservation Office in Siem Reap, actually is a key element to understand the history of the Bayonne after its consecration, and it helps us to contest actually the veracity of a so-called iconoclastic reaction after G7. Actually, that's not true, and the history is much more complex than that. To finish, actually, it's with modern works. Actually, this story of Parmentier's photograph pushed me to look also at my production of photograph as an archaeologist and architect during the last 30 years in Angkor. And I went into my hard disk and looked at what I produced, more or less 10,000 pictures in 10 years in the 90s. For instance, a PhD, I made only 4,000, which is actually already in a couple of years as much as Parmentier Veroscope collection we have at the EFEO. But of course, things turn completely crazy after 2002, 2004, when we started having digital cameras, where we started then to collect in more or less than 10 years, more than 100,000 pictures. This is, for instance, the number of pictures taken in 1 month or sometimes 2 months excavation campaign per year. You see, we are getting sometimes more than 6, 7, 8,000 pictures in a single archaeological campaign, which actually pose, of course, different problems of cataloging, storage, identification, and so on. But beyond, actually, we have also different kind of picture nowadays. We call it, it's not photograph anymore. It can be radar, it can be LiDAR, as we started LiDAR in 2012 in Angkor, which bring us a new perspective, a new vision on Angkor in its capacity somehow to go through the vegetation. Actually, LiDAR doesn't go through anything, but actually it pass through the small holes between the vegetation and help us to have a digital model of the site at the end of the survey. And these are actually terabytes of three-dimensional points. It's not picture anymore. It's just a digital survey. And of course, the number of pictures is rocketing high during the last couple of years with the development of 3D surveys and photogrammetry. It's become extremely handy, very easy to process. For instance, that's a naga I just surveyed last month with my iPhone. It took me 1 minute to generate this three-dimensional thing. But actually, just this model is totalizing something like 200 pictures. So how they will be stored, how we can access to this kind of data in the future, that's actually the kind of problem we are facing. So I will end just my small discussion, which is already too long, going back to the first photograph actually taken in Angkor by order of King of Siam. Actually, the French actually did not introduce photography in Angkor, and clearly, as Kevin mentioned, the myth of Angkor was part of the, as developed also by the French, but somehow, and recent works clearly show then the myth of Angkor is a much longer and older history, which actually started far beyond the colonial period in the late 19th century. And as mentioned, yeah, the first photograph may show actually a vision of Angkor, which is empty. Actually, it's not really empty. We can still see some pictures in the frame, and somehow it's look quite the same than Angkor Wat about 2 weeks ago when I was there, with almost no tourists at all. So I will finish my discussion here somehow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christophe. Invite Kevin to turn on his camera as well. Thanks to both of you. There are quite a few questions in the Q&A box, but I just want to quickly throw one in for both Kevin and Christophe to think about, which is in Christophe's presentation, we saw that a couple of the photos that Kevin spoke about were stereographs, which don't come across, of course, but you can't tell they're stereographs when you look at the original publications that Kevin referred to. So the fact that they're stereographed, which for those in the audience who don't know what stereographs are, you're meant to get like a 3D appreciation of the space. I think that actually complicates quite a bit of what Kevin was saying in terms of how the photograph was meant to, I guess, constitute a kind of experience of the space that Parmentier wanted to convey to his readers. And it's very interesting to me that he's using a stereoscopic camera to capture the spaces versus an easier, I guess, wet plate or silver gelatin image. And that might be actually something for Kevin to think about as well. Like, how does that add to the argument that you're making with that paper? But let me, Kevin, do you want to say anything before I go to the Q&A?
I do not want to answer that stereograph question.
So from, there's no name for this question, but a question for Kevin. The early photographs of Angkor, like the one by Zell, have had an enduring effect on perceptions of Angkor even today. So what impact do you see Parmentier's more unusual approach having had on the way Angkor and I guess Southeast Asia more broadly have been perceived and represented?
I guess I would say that historically, Parmentier's photography, because they were published in a more scholarly, architectural kind of context, they have not had like any impact apart from researchers, right, or like specialists. So yeah, their impact was much more limited. For us right now, I think one value of them is that they complicate the field of photography in like the late 19th and early 20th century, right? It's
Yeah.
not just these touristic photos, but there is this like other, you could call them another genre of like photography, right? And I think that, you know, if it complicates that history of photography, I think it's a good thing.
And I think also the availability of the photos now through the EFEO archive, which like a lot of it is available digitally. And I think that allows for these other stories and for researchers to think about them further. So
Yeah, if I may add, it's totally right. Actually, this kind of pictures, even if of course I would say architects or archaeologists had their daily work in Angkor, we're also producing kind of stereotype pictures of nice Angkor Wat reflecting on the pond and so on, this classic stuff, or the big roots and so on. Of course, sometimes they also enjoyed it. Of course, you can't live on a daily basis in this kind of environment without at some point to be sensible to what you see. And somehow you are trapped into this mental vision, and you are actually also capturing it through your pictures. And it's true when I made myself also pictures of the causeway of Angkor Wat and this kind of stuff, not that much. And globally beyond, for instance, my own experience, if we look at the EFEO collection as a whole, I told you we have some, not the Parmentier, Carpo, Groli, and so on, which are more individuals and so on. But if you look at the so-called EFEO institutional collection, which is about 26,000 pictures, we have, yeah, let's say 12,000, more than 12,000 related about Angkor, which is somehow more than almost 50% is about Angkor. And among these 50%, most of them are about Angkor Wat and Bayonne, which are the main key points. So somehow there is this attractive effect of accumulating pictures on the main monuments. And it's sometimes very difficult to get out of that and to document things outside of the box, outside of actually the central interest. Even if, of course, it's directly related to historical reason and by the fact that actually archaeologists and architects have been working much more on the monumental aspect than anything else. So that also explains this tropism about Angkor.
And on that note, I'm going to skip ahead to William Tan's question, which is related to this. So William says, thank you, Kevin, for this insightful lecture. Colonial photography often deflates a three-dimensional slide into a neutral two-dimensional image for archaeological scrutiny, which have implications on knowledge and power. But if I understand your lecture correctly, Parmentier's practice reveals process and evolution while opening up the site to contingency and the passage of time. Would you say this complicates Parmentier's positionality as a French colonial photographer? Judging from the ambiguity of his lens, are we to absolve him even slightly of the European gaze? It's a very complicated question, but very interesting. And Christoph talked a bit about this earlier.
So I would say yes, that does complicate him, right? As like this colonial scholar. Definitely one of the goals of like my paper was to not just repeat this kind of Orientalist kind of like understanding of these scholars, right? Including artists. So it's kind of like, how do we think past, how do we think beyond like Orientalism or like this kind of post-colonial understanding? So what I did today was to hopefully broaden Parmentier's practice to show that, you know, even though sometimes he does slip into this kind of Orientalism, there's another side of him, which is like more interesting, right? Which is, if you think about it, very modernist, you know, very interested in like ambiguity, disruption, like found objects, all these, you know, like opening up into the passage of time, things like that, which definitely complicate him. But thanks for your question.
So the last question in the Q&A box, actually, either of you might be able to answer, which is whether there's any record of Parmentier experimenting with different techniques of photographing the object or specific tools and technologies in order to produce better photographic reproductions. So she says, from the first images shown by Dr. Chua, it seems that Parmentier captured the photograph of the objects or temporal spaces the way they were found. So I guess a question about technique and whether that shifted to contribute further to his archaeological practice. Or maybe the info is not there, I'm not sure.
If you're asking what like cameras he was using, I tried to find information about that, but I was kind of unsuccessful. So I, you know, work mostly from like the photos themselves. I do know that the Bante Sray photos, a lot of them are heliographs. And that's as much as I can say. Christophe, do you know more?
Yeah. In fact, here again, we may have more than 4,000 verascopes, stereoscopic verascope from Parmentier. But we know also that it's only a portion, probably a significant portion, but still a portion of Parmentier's collection, because actually his archives were partially burned down by the Japanese in 1940 in Phnom Penh during the coup. So actually Parmentier lost part of his archives during in 1940. But still, what we have and the photographic elements we have in his collection are only verascopes. On the other way, you know, Parmentier had a peculiar position. He was the supervisor of archaeological works and so on, meaning that actually he was not particularly working in Angkor, but working all around in, at that time, French Indochina. And part of this photograph may have been taken also in Angkor, but with a different material, with actually the camera at the photographic lab of the Conservation Angkor. So it's possible that he may have used different instruments. He may have used his own stereoscopic camera during his own surveys and so on. But when he was in Angkor for the production of the Conservation Angkor daily work, he actually used another kind of camera, which actually we don't have much details about. And frankly, that's the kind of research which may now be possible, considering all the classification of the EFEO archives, which has been made during the last couple of years. Now we have better access of huge quantities of this kind of information.
So sorry, Christophe. So inside the archives, you keep all the physical prints and slides and all that. Is that they're all in Paris?
Yes. The original photographs on glass, you know, the stereoscopic verascope, they are on glass. They are kept, yes, in Paris. Most of them, or anyway, for Parmentier, all of the collection has been digitalized in high resolution, but they have not been made available on the web, contrary to the 26,000. The 26,000 EFEO collection is already available online. But these Parmentier ones, including the one from Carpeaux, from Grolier, from Finot, and so on and others, are not yet available online, just basically because we have, it's take extremely long time to put correct legends and to index this photograph. Unfortunately, we lost the register with everything. So we have a full pack of 4,000 pictures of Parmentier about everything. It goes from Hanoi to China, to Cambodia, to his excavation in Champa, to Angkor, to pieces of and bits of architecture in the middle of nowhere without proper legends, or sometimes it's handwritten, very difficult to read. So it's a bit of a mess, which was a very interesting mess to go through these 4,000 pictures. Actually, I had to go through 6,000 pictures for that talk, because actually Verascope of Parmentier more or less duplicates some taken by Louis Finot at that time. Louis Finot and Parmentier were doing a lot of surveys together, epigraphist and architect working hand by hand, and sometimes they duplicate Verascope. So we have duplicates in the two collections.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I just want to thank everyone again. There don't seem to be any more questions, and we've come to the birds 4 o'clock in Singapore, so we've come to the end. But I just wanted to thank again both Kevin and Christophe for their talks, their papers, which brought up a lot of very different issues for me to think about personally with my research. And I will close the lecture here since there are no more questions. But thank you, everyone. Thank you, Christophe. Thank you, Kevin, again. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, everyone.